Solomonster back here with you, and as I sit here about a week or so now into 2020, I wanted to take a few minutes to look back at the decade that just ended and rank who I think are the top 5 wrestlers of the decade, spanning 2010 through 2019. And before anybody asks, so what's your criteria for ranking these 5 people? There is no set criteria. There is no official set criteria. Everyone has their own criteria. You know, if you think the 5 best wrestlers of the decade are the ones that have the best matches, then that's what you'll base your list around. You know, my list encompasses people who aren't just great wrestlers or workers. There's that little something extra about them that separates them from everybody else. That intangible, or their overall impact on business, all of it. All of that stuff is factored in. And so, with that being said, normally with these like rankings and countdowns, I would start from number 5 and work my way up to number 1. I'm not going to do that this time. I'm not wasting any time here. I'm starting with number 1. The man who I think was the wrestler of the decade is the ace of New Japan Pro Wrestling, and that is Hiroshi Tanahashi. And when I was introduced to the greatness that is New Japan early in the decade, I mean, really trying to learn who everybody was and follow along, at least with like the big shows and the big matches, I was blown away. I was blown away by what I saw. It was so different than what we are used to seeing on television. It's just a different product, you know. So here in this country, whether it's WWE or Impact, which I was also watching at the time, it was just a completely different product, a totally different culture. You saw some of that Japanese influence in Ring of Honor. If you were a fan of Ring of Honor back in the day, it's pretty obvious. I mean, there was some influence there. But Tanahashi was the man. He was the guy. He was already the top guy. And to truly understand what he meant to that company and the resurgence of New Japan after a very dark period, you need to go back to the mid-2000s when New Japan was in really rough shape. They were close to bankruptcy at one point, maybe more than one point. Antonio Inoki had founded New Japan back in 1972, and when he sold his interest in the promotion in 2005, and there's conflicting stories about, was he forced out? Probably, because what he was doing at the time was a lot of just MMA stuff, had sort of infected the promotion, and they would take wrestlers and put them up against MMA fighters, and just there was a lot of that going on. It wasn't doing them any good. And so 2005 comes and Inoki is gone. At that point, it wasn't immediate, but that was the beginning of a long, slow turnaround in their fortunes. Fortunes that were built largely on the back of a young Tanahashi. I believe Shinsuke Nakamura was Inoki's choice to be the top guy or the ace of New Japan. And it just didn't work out. It never happened. Nakamura flopped. And maybe flop is too strong of a word. I mean, my sense is that he was popular, but he just did not take off really in popularity to the degree that he did until he became the king of strong style, and that was years later. So Nakamura didn't work out in the role initially, and Katsuyori Shibata, he left wrestling for mixed martial arts. You kind of have this trio of younger guys. You had Nakamura, you had Shibata, and you had Tanahashi. So Shibata decides he wants to go do MMA. And in fact, when he came back to New Japan many years later, there was tension between he and Tanahashi when Shibata came back, because Tanahashi felt, and he talked about this in his book, that Shibata deserted the company at the exact time that they needed him. He left them at the worst possible time, and he never forgot that. But the beneficiary of all this, the beneficiary of Nakamura not working out and Shibata leaving, was Hiroshi Tanahashi, stepping in and having the company basically built around him. So year after year, Tanahashi, he went out there, he had incredible match after incredible match. He helped attract new faces to the shows and families instead of just the traditional audience. And he played a big role, not the only role. I think it's a little too simplistic to say that Tanahashi saved New Japan, but he played a large part in the turnaround of that company. I think Meltzer once said that he helped quadruple business for New Japan. That's how down in the dumps they were for many years. Now, you look at his work, Tanahashi had classic battles throughout the decade. He did whatever was asked of him by the company. He worked through injuries. He would tape him up and go out there. I mean, maybe not the smartest thing for him to do, but he would still go out there and have great matches, even in spite of it all. Right from the start of the decade on through the end of it, even as he was slowing down a little bit. Look, we saw it at last year's Wrestle Kingdom. The match he had with Kenny Omega. And even the match he had to start this new decade a few days ago against Chris Jericho. He's older. He's in his early 40s now, but if he's slowing down, he's not doing a very good job of it if he's slowing down as much as some people say he is. He had 2 G1 Climax wins this past decade in 2015 and 2018, 8 IWGP heavyweight titles, more than anyone else in history, and 4 of those championships came in the last decade. And 7 Tokyo Dome main events at Wrestle Kingdom in the last decade for Tanahashi. And of course, there is his rivalry against Kazuchika Okada. It is the stuff of legend. I mean, those matches, the matches those two had together were the very best of pro wrestling. In the ring, in this past decade. It was the rivalry. I mean, as lucky as WWE was to have Steve Austin and The Rock together on the same roster at the same time during the Attitude Era, and boy were they lucky. New Japan was just as lucky to have Tanahashi and Okada together at the same time on theirs. So Tanahashi is my number 1 in terms of wrestler of the decade. But without Tanahashi, there may not have been an Okada, who I have ranked as my number 2 wrestler of the decade. They kind of go hand in hand, don't they? In a lot of ways. And there are going to be people who say you got to rank Okada at number 1. I'm not even saying those people are wrong. Again, everybody has their own criteria when it comes to this stuff. And I went back and forth on this. And one of the reasons that I waited an extra week or 10 days or whatever it was when I finalized what my top 5 were, the reason I had to wait a little bit longer is because the top 2 spots kept flip-flopping. I had a hard time going back and forth and figuring out who should be number 1, who should be number 2. The rest of the list was solid. It's been solid for about 3 weeks now. But I had to think about this. I had to say, both guys, there's a lot of similarities there. They both had a lot of success. You could make the argument either way. But I went with Okada as my number 2. Now, whereas Tanahashi was great all decade, Okada's first 2 years of the decade were a waste. They were nothing memorable. Much like the time he spent on Excursion in TNA. Let us not forget. That's why New Japan no longer works with Impact Wrestling, even though there's a totally new regime now in place. They have not forgotten how they used Okada all those many years ago. Okada returned to New Japan at Wrestle Kingdom 6. So this goes back to 2012. And when you go back, I was curious. I said, let me go back and see what this return match was for Okada. And it was a match against Yoshihashi in the middle of the show. He won in a 4-minute match with a Rainmaker clothesline that was so horrible, I even hesitate to call it a Rainmaker. It was more like a little like a little drizzle. You would die laughing if you saw him do this move. That early version of the Rainmaker was terrible. And to see how far Okada would come in just the span of 2 to 3 years after that is incredible. And I'll say it now. If I had a favorite wrestler, and I've said this in the podcast a few times, people say, oh, who's your favorite wrestler? Right now, I don't know that I have a favorite wrestler right now. But years ago, all time, who's my favorite wrestler? It's Bret the Hitman Hart. I'm a Bret Hart guy. So Bret's my all-time favorite. I could watch his matches all day long. When his DVD came out, probably about 10 or 11 years ago now, and he got to handpick the matches that he wanted to be on the DVD. It was like a 3-disc set. I sequestered myself at home to watch this thing. Just the variety of opponents that he would wrestle, whether it was an Owen Hart or a big guy like a Bam Bam Bigelow or somebody like that. The different finishes. It was almost like a different finish You know, it wasn't very rarely it felt like did Brett actually win these big matches with the sharpshooter. It was a victory roll. It was some other kind of move. So I just loved it. I just loved the variety of his matches. I loved his work. Okada is up there with Bret Hart, to me, as the greatest that I have ever seen when it comes to in-ring work. Some people will laugh and say, oh, how can you put Bret Hart and Okada in the same category, man? He's so much better than Bret Hart. All right, maybe. But to me, Bret is just, he's at the top of that list, and Okada's right up there with him. And maybe he is above him. But I will say that Okada is among the best, top two that I have ever seen when it comes to in-ring work. The guy is amazing. He's the longest reigning IWGP Heavyweight Champion of all time, 720 days. He holds the record for the most successful title defenses with 12. You look at the matches that this guy has had. With the likes and the caliber of opponent, the likes of Tanahashi, Omega, Naito, Shibata. I mean, that match with Shibata, which was really the last Shibata match, it's hard to go back and watch that because of the headbutt spot and knowing what happened to Shibata, but that was an incredible match. Kota Ibushi, AJ Styles, and Okada had some great matches. Will Ospreay, Minoru Suzuki, that match they had at Suzuki's, I think it was Suzuki's like a 30th anniversary show or something. It was outdoors in the rain. That's the one that stands out to me. They had more than just that match. I think they had a match at Royal Quest last year, but that's the match that really stands out to me because of the atmosphere. Plus, they call him the Rainmaker, so it kind of fits. But just name after name after name, this guy goes in there and he has classics with each and every one of them. And to have the kind of feud, the kind of rivalry, and the kind of matches that he had with Tanahashi would make him a Hall of Famer all by itself. Now imagine having two rivalries like that. The other one being with Kenny Omega. And he becomes an all-timer all of a sudden. To have two different feuds with two different opponents and the caliber of matches he had with those two guys within a few years of each other is... It's ridiculous. It's what it is. So when all is said and done, he will have surpassed Tanahashi, if he hasn't already. I know some people would say he already has. If you're of the opinion that he hasn't, he's got a ways to go, he's still young yet, all that is true, he will surpass him. I mean, given how young he is, he will surpass him. It is absolutely going to happen. He will end up as number one, the greatest of all time, when it comes to all of those. Now, you know what, I was going to say the Japanese stars and the New Japan talent, but I would even just make a general statement and say by the time all is said and done, he'll be the greatest there ever was. You know, I just could not bring myself to rank him above Tanahashi for the decade, though. But again, I went back and forth a whole bunch of times. It was close. But I got Tanahashi 1 and Okada number 2. Which brings us to number 3. My number 3 pick for Wrestler of the Decade also happens to be my number 1 pick for WWE Wrestler of the Decade. And it will not be a popular choice for some, but that man is Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar returned to WWE after an 8-year absence. We all know how it ended back in 2004. It wasn't exactly the most amicable split he wanted out. They forced him to sign a 10-year non-compete, which was ridiculous. It was never going to hold up in court. Of course, it didn't. He ended up joining UFC. He became an MMA fighter, became the UFC heavyweight champion, had some success there. 8 years later, there he is in 2012 back on Monday Night Raw. And he made an impact on his very first night back. He lays out John Cena. His very first match back at Extreme Rules in 2012. A match of the year caliber main event against John Cena. With an outcome that I still to this day disagree with, but it's not a hill I'm going to die on, so I've learned to let that go. But it was the same John Cena that he dominated at SummerSlam in 2014 in a way that we have never seen anybody booked to dominate John Cena before. Or really any WWE headliner in a pay-per-view main event like that. I cannot think of another case in that company where a top, I'm not talking like, near the top, a top name. Cena was to his era in WWE what Hogan was to his, or Brett when he was the star, or Shawn, or Stone Cold, or The Rock, and all those guys. For that generation, for that era, it was John Cena. And for him to go in there and get suplexed 16,000 times and be dominated the way that he was something that we had never seen before. And then there's the Undertaker streak. You talk about moments of the decade that stand out. Well, there's one. That may be number one. The end of the Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania. And I remember at the time thinking, how do you have Brock, of all people, if you're going to break the streak, and I still believe the streak never should have been broken. You're going to break the streak with a guy who, is a part-time guy who had left the company, and there was so much, animosity there for so long, and it was just such an odd choice. Of course, he went on to become this nearly unstoppable monster ever since. Unless you kick him in the dick. It's really his only weakness. You kick him in the dick. But he beat the streak. He beat the streak. He destroyed John Cena. He wrestled and defeated all of the top names pretty much in that company for the entire decade. Triple H, CM Punk, Daniel Bryan, AJ Styles, Randy Orton, Braun Strowman, Finn Balor, Samoa Joe, Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, Roman Reigns, Bill Goldberg, Kofi Kingston. He sneezed. He beat Kofi. He beat him by accident. Didn't even realize he had beaten him. Cain Velasquez, Rey Mysterio, all of them vanquished at one time or another. Now, some of those names also have wins. Lesnar's not undefeated the last 8 years. But those wins are few and far between. Now, you can look at it kayfabe-wise. You can look at all the names he's dominated. You can look at it and say, it's all a work, bro. He didn't really beat anybody. Well, this is true. This is true. This is where it sometimes is a little odd when you talk about pro wrestling. So, okay, you look at how he's been booked and his position in the company. And there has never been anyone booked as strongly and as someone more important than Brock Lesnar. Not since Hulk Hogan or Stone Cold Steve Austin. And you could even argue they may not have been as booked or may not have been booked as invincibly as Brock Lesnar has been. Even those guys, at one time or another, were booked to show weakness or some kind of injury angle to get sympathy on them for the big comeback so they can beat the heel, they can beat the monster. You haven't really seen that with Brock Lesnar. For years, nearly everything in the title picture on whichever brand it was, has run through Brock Lesnar. First as the WWE World Heavyweight Champion, and then later on as the Universal Champion, and now as the WWE Champion again. Every key star in that company at one time or another in these last 8 years has had to go through Brock Lesnar. He is the gatekeeper. He is the final boss. That's how valuable he has been in the eyes of Vince McMahon. You could argue, where's the value today? It's been so many years. Is the value still there in Brock Lesnar? It's a valid question to ask. It's been a long time. People get tired of it. But that's how valuable, in the eyes of that company, that's how valuable this man has been. Now let's look beyond the people that he's beaten. As I try to explain what my thought process was here in picking Brock Lesnar. Let's look beyond the people that he's been booked to beat. His matches. Even after all these years, his matches still, when he walks out there, have an aura to them that no one else on that roster has. There's a specialness to them that nobody else can replicate. They have this big fight feel to them. It doesn't get tiresome to see suplex. Yeah, it does. You know what else has gotten tiresome? Dive. Knee strike. Tope suicida. Dive. Super kick. You'd be a hypocrite to criticize Brock Lesnar for all of his German suplexes and not call out the repetitive nature of most of the matches that we see these days in WWE and NXT and AEW and, dare I say, even New Japan sometimes. As great as those matches are. You can't call one out without calling out the other. Not anymore. Just because you may not like the guy or because he doesn't show up all the time. I wish he showed up more often. He probably wouldn't be as special, but yeah, I wish he would show up more often. But just because he doesn't show up every week on TV and he doesn't wrestle on the weekly shows, again, that has a lot to do with why his matches, I think, still feel so special. When everybody else, even if they made a return, they made a debut, they're the talk of the town. They feel so special. 3 weeks later, the shine is gone. They beat these people into the ground. And those matches of his, by the way, he's had a lot of kick-ass matches this past decade. Some of the biggest matches in the company, some of the best matches of this past decade, like it or not, involved Brock Lesnar. The matches that he had with John Cena at Extreme Rules and SummerSlam, very unique in their own way. Not exactly a clinic, but I love both of those matches. They were different. They weren't these 30-minute dazzling matches that we're so used to seeing with the constant kickouts and the near falls, which work. I'm not even shitting on those matches. I just got done talking about Tanahashi and Okada, for crying out loud. But it's just different with Lesnar. And it stands out, I think, because of that. They were just so different than anything at that time that we had seen in WWE. I thought they were great. His WrestleMania match with The Undertaker sucked until the finish made it this memorable, legendary match. But the follow-up matches between them at SummerSlam and the one they had at Hell in a Cell, I thought were very good. Lesnar, Cena, Rollins, and that triple threat at the Royal Rumble in 2015, that's one of the best matches of the decade. His first match with Roman Reigns at WrestleMania 31 was very good. The Money in the Bank cash-in, took it from very good to legendary in WrestleMania lore. His match with CM Punk, the no disqualification match they had at SummerSlam, that was my match of the year in 2013. That was absolutely fantastic. Lesnar works even better against the smaller opponents. He had those back-to-back Survivor Series matches, first against AJ Styles and then against Daniel Bryan. Both matches, excellent. Excellent. And believe me, we've seen AJ Styles and people who are great wrestlers have some clunkers in WWE. Just because they're great or they have a history and a reputation of being great doesn't mean that all their matches are great. I saw a lot of disappointing matches from AJ when it came to the feud with Nakamura, when it came to the feud with Kevin Owens. But he went in there with Brock and they had an excellent match. Daniel Bryan went in there, had an excellent match. It was a match I thought I'd never have the chance to see. I only wish we would have gotten it in 2014. When I first pitched the idea, I was hoping that maybe they could do it at WrestleMania 30, and of course that wasn't in the plans. So we got it about 5 years too late, but it was still great. Even the match he had with Rey Mysterio at the most recent Survivor Series where Dominic got involved, that was a lot of fun. So I think when you take a step back and you actually look at the matches that he had, look at the programs that he was involved in, they were not all great, but you look by and large at the body of work that he put together in WWE since he's come back, and they were damn good. And it's been some of the most fun that I've had watching WWE this entire decade. He checks enough of the boxes that you look for. There's no one else like him. And it's why Brock Lesnar is the WWE wrestler of the decade. And he's third on the list below Tanahashi and Okada, mainly because WWE doesn't live or die anymore based solely off one individual performer, not like they used to. Which I think is by design, by the way. I think that's the way they want it. But when you look at New Japan, without Tanahashi, without Okada, I'm not sure there is a New Japan anymore. Without them sort of coming of age at the time that they did, and finding the success and the popularity that they did. Should anyone be wondering why I have 2 New Japan talents on my list above Lesnar. But Lesnar is number 3. Number 4 is AJ Styles. AJ Styles was a headliner and a world champion in 3 different promotions this decade. Although I would argue that his strongest and his most successful years in TNA came before 2010, not after. Plus we had the Claire Lynch stuff, which I would rather forget that. But he had success and was a world champion in 3 different promotions. And that's not something that too many people can say that they were able to do. He's a champion in TNA. Spent the large majority of his career there. Went to New Japan. And from day one, he was headlining. Became IWGP Heavyweight Champion. Had some fantastic matches against the likes of Okada and Suzuki during his time there. Got booted out of the Bullet Club right into the WWE. Debuted at the Royal Rumble. First WrestleMania match against Chris Jericho. I remember that being, it was pretty good. A little disappointing, a little underwhelming, but it was pretty good. And then the next 2 pay-per-views back to back, he's headlining for the championship against Roman Reigns. And then he ends up feuding with John Cena. And that really, to me, is what solidified him in WWE as being one of the top guys there. He had matches with John Cena that were as good as anything, any match that you would have seen in WWE that entire year. And there were some good matches that year. There were some great matches that year. They had their first encounter at Money in the Bank. I think the Anderson and Gallows got involved in the finish. That kind of was like, all right, whatever. The match was excellent. They went on to SummerSlam 2016 here in Brooklyn. Absolutely fantastic match. Match of the year. Match of the year stuff. And kind of different because AJ was the heel. I mean, he had his fans, but he was positioned as the heel going into that match. And he beats John Cena clean, right in the middle of the ring. And it was shocking, not just because he was a heel, but because when the news first broke that he was probably coming to WWE, a lot of people were very concerned. I had questions. What are they going to do with this guy? What are they going to do with AJ Styles? At that point, he's almost 40 years old. He spent the majority of his career in TNA. They had a hiring freeze for a while on even bringing in people from TNA at all. That was like a Vince McMahon edict at one point. That's what they thought of TNA. Now they're going to bring in one of the biggest names to come out of TNA, one of their basically homegrown talents. Are they really going to put him over their own top stars? Are they really going to make him a world champion? A lot of people were rightly skeptical about that. And what they have done with AJ Styles since he debuted in WWE has been a pleasant surprise. He has been positioned as a star pretty much since day one in that company. And in his first year, again, back-to-back pay-per-view main events against Roman Reigns, multiple wins over John Cena, the company's biggest star, and they put the championship on him. He won the WWE title. He had some of the best matches all year in that company. He went on to the Royal Rumble at the Alamo Dome, dropped the championship to John Cena. Another excellent match between the two of them. And since then, he's been entrenched as one of the key guys in that company. And I'm sure now they don't look at him and go, hey, it's the TNA guy. He's been there long enough where he's part of that group. He's part of that family now. I really did not expect them to go all in on AJ the way they did, and I was happy about that. You know, he's kind of like one of these once-in-a-lifetime talents. Imagine them bringing in AJ Styles and jobbing him out or making him Shorty G or something like that. But they did right by the guy. He hasn't always had some of these feuds and matches that he's had sometimes have been overwhelming. I mentioned before some of the matches with not Tanahashi, with Nakamura, the Kevin Owens feud from a couple of years ago. There was just something missing. It wasn't all that great. You know, not everything the guy touches turns to gold, but he's still one of the best in the world. He's older now. He's slowing down, but he's still one of the best in the world. He's one of the best talents in wrestling in the last decade plus, easily. You know, and WWE was very fortunate to be able to bring him in when they did. But you look at the body of work that he has put together in all of these different places that he has been. And as important a piece of the puzzle as he has been for a lot of these companies, and I don't see how you don't have AJ Styles in your top 3 or your top 5 or your top 10. I have him in my top 5, which I think is reasonable. Then we have number 5. Number 5, wrestler of the decade on my list is Daniel Bryan. Daniel Bryan, you guys know if you listen to the podcast for any number of years, I was a big Daniel Bryan fan. I'm still a Daniel Bryan fan. I was watching Daniel Bryan in person when he was still Bryan Danielson. killing himself in Ring of Honor and you know, the eye injury and wrestling Takeshi Morishima. I remember all that stuff. You know, wrestling Nigel McGuinness for the Pure title in ROH. I go back to all those days in the mid to late 2000s. So I've had the chance up close and personal to see this guy's work from day one. And he's always been a special talent. You talk about AJ Styles being a special talent. Daniel Bryan's in the same conversation. And he came to WWE, and who knew? Who knew that he would get over the way that he did? You know, here's this small, he's like a normal looking guy. Looked like me. He was in better shape than me, but is Vince McMahon really going to push this guy one day as being a world champion? You would have had people laugh you out of the room if you would have said that when he first debuted. His career almost ended in that company before it even started with the whole Justin Roberts thing, choking him with the tie when the Nexus debuted. And then 2 months later, they said, hey, lay low for a couple months. And then they brought him back. And he was involved. You know, he was wrestling for the United States Championship. He feuded, it feels like 15 different times with Sheamus. Which, of course, culminated in that championship match at WrestleMania in Miami, where he lost in 18 seconds, which was really the spark, looking back, that lit the fuse on this whole Yes movement. It would be a while before it would really catch fire, but, you know, at the beginning there, I mean, my God, some of the reactions he was getting, I mean, the next night in the building in Miami, the place was going nuts. They had him in one backstage segment. He wasn't even on the show. He was in a dark match. I've never seen a live crowd react to somebody like this before. It was insane. Not since the days of me going to the Monday Night Raw shows in the late 90s when Stone Cold would come out and the glass would shatter. I have not seen someone get the kind of live reactions that this guy was getting. You want to fast forward a little bit to the Yes Movement stuff in 2014. I've not seen crowd reactions in WWE like that since the days of Stone Cold and The Rock. Now, maybe business-wise, it didn't quite translate to the business that those guys were doing in the Attitude Era. I won't dare make that comparison. But crowd reactions? I had not seen anybody get a reaction like that in 15 plus years. I just shared a clip on Twitter a few days ago. I love watching this clip back every now and then. The angle they shot when he was part of the Wyatt family, and he broke away from the Wyatt family. This was in January of 2014. There was a cage match. The match was over, and Bryan broke away from Bray Wyatt, and the place came unglued. Every kick that he threw, every move that he did, putting his fingers in the air and doing the flying knee. It was too bad he doesn't remember any of it because he was concussed. It was one of the greatest moments of this guy's career probably, and he doesn't remember a damn thing. But it's moments like that were a very big part of WWE this past decade. When I think back on WWE, the decade, 2010 to 2019, the success that Daniel Bryan had, the Yes movement, the crowd reactions, the fans, the whole angle they did where they brought the quote-unquote fans into the ring. He wants that match at WrestleMania with Triple H. He goes to WrestleMania in New Orleans. He beats Triple H. He gets to the main event. He taps out Batista. He becomes the champion. It was this great story arc. It was this great culmination for this guy. He was the guy. Now, little did we know that he would get hurt. After that WrestleMania, the guy's whole world fell apart. I think he got engaged. But Connor, right, the Make-A-Wish kid, died a few weeks later. His father died. He got hurt. I mean, he went from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. And he had to be stripped of the championship. And that's where the neck issues began. And so the reason he's not higher on this list is in part because of the retirement. He had to step away from the ring. 3 years he missed. He had 3 years of his career taken away from him. He was on TV. He was the general manager. He was playing a role on TV. But he was taken out of the ring for a 3-year period. It's like why CM Punk, I didn't consider him. I mean, I briefly thought about it. The pipe bomb, everything that kind of stemmed from it. That was a pivotal moment in that decade. But it's hard to believe, it's been 6 years since we've seen CM Punk in a WWE ring. I don't see how you can put somebody in the top 3 or call him the wrestler of the decade, when he hasn't wrestled in 6 years. To me, that's foolish. And so the 3-year layoff does hurt Bryan. It's why I put him below AJ. I couldn't in good conscience put him above AJ, no matter how special that run was in the middle of the decade, just because AJ was around that whole time. And again, he was successful in 3 different promotions, not just one. And I think that's got to count for something. But he had this great comeback story. People didn't think he would ever be cleared. He was going to have to let his contract run out. He'd go work in Mexico. He'd go work in Japan. He'd go back to Ring of Honor. He would do all these different things. I think that would have been a lot of fun, by the way. It's too bad they didn't let him go. But he had this great comeback story. And ever since he came back, he's been having, great matches again. And hopefully he's got a lot more left to have. I don't know if he'll be able to get one out of the Fiend character at the Royal Rumble. We'll find out, I guess, in a few weeks. Thankfully, they'll be in a baseball stadium, which possibly means no red light this time in their match. But the thing that he will be known for in that decade, and really I think in his WWE career, is the yes stuff and the build to WrestleMania 14. Or WrestleMania 14. That's a different guy. That was the guy who wore black boots and black trunks. It took him 8 years to get to that point. I'm thinking 2014. WrestleMania 30. CM Punk just on his Instagram story, I'm going to have a video up on the channel tomorrow about this, shared a run sheet with the original lineup for what WrestleMania 30 was going to be. And Daniel Bryan talked about it in his book. He was going to be 5th or 6th down from the top in a meaningless, just middle of the card match against Sheamus. And one of the greatest moments and nights of this guy's career almost didn't happen. The fans willed it into existence. That and CM Punk walking out. That had about as much to do with it, let's be honest. But all the pieces fell into place, the stars aligned, and this guy had one of the defining moments of the entire decade. When I think of that decade, I think of The Undertaker's streak being broken, and I think of that same night, Daniel Bryan winning the championship. And I think of Sasha and Bayley and their match at NXT TakeOver in Brooklyn, which really, if you think about it, in terms of when they really started heavily pushing this whole women's revolution movement, you could trace it back to that match. And that night, and you see them in the ring, putting the 4 fingers up, those are the 3 moments that stand out in my head. The streak, Bryan winning the championship and his whole story leading up to it, and Sasha and Bayley at that TakeOver show in Brooklyn in 2015. So, Daniel Bryan is my number 5 on my list of wrestlers of the decade. And then there were other names I considered as well. You can make the argument for John Cena and his importance to the company. You can make the argument for Chris Jericho. I really wanted to try to get Jericho on this list. I could not put him above any of these 5. But you look at what Jericho's done, even in WWE, the list, and all the times he reinvented himself with different characters, and the alliance with Kevin Owens, and all the other stuff he did, and then leaving, and working in New Japan, and going to AEW, and becoming the champion, and trying to help this upstart promotion, reinventing himself. Guy's almost 50 years old. You could absolutely make the argument that Chris Jericho, if he's not the wrestler of the decade, that he's in the top 3. Or he's in the top 5. He didn't make my top 5. So it's Tanahashi, Okada, Lesnar, AJ, and Bryan. That's my personal top 5 list of the top 5 wrestlers of the decade 2010 to 2019. Let me know your thoughts. Why I'm crazy. Why I'm wrong. Why I'm right. In the comments section. And what your list looks like. If your list is different, well, what does your list look like? Tell me what your list looks like and why. Leave a comment down below. And hit that sub button on the channel if you are not already subscribed. We've got a lot of new content going up on the channel this week, including the 2-part Wrestle Kingdom review, and a lot of other really cool stuff coming as well. The weekly Dynamite streams every Wednesday, as you guys know. And in a few weeks, it'll be time for the Royal Rumble, one of the biggest events of the year. So a lot of good stuff here coming in the month of January. Thank you all for your support. I will see you back here on the channel again real soon. Until then, take care, guys.